Greetings and salutations, this is Imperator Vespasian bringing you a unboxing video for black powder Napoleonic French line lancers. I've got these from Warlord games. They are to augment our black powder armies. We are investing quite a bit in black powder recently. We're augmenting the game we've got. We've just got Waterloo at the moment, so we've just got La Haye Sainte actually at the moment, and we wanted to spread out a bit and have a lot more stuff available. And when it came to getting new figures, we sort of sat around and said, well, what do we need? Well, we need more French infantry because you can never have too many French, and some artillery. So yeah, he wanted artillery, so he said artillery, and then he started screaming, where are my horses? Because he's seen the Waterloo film, and in that there's loads of horses, and he wanted lots and lots and lots of horses. So all I've got is hussars. Dragoons. I've got dragoons for the British, and he now has lancers. Lancers are pretty much awesome. Right, so these are standard French lancers. They're not the Polish lancers, they're just line lancers. And I'll get into that in a minute. So, here we have the figures. What's this? A officer on horseback. That is actually really good. I didn't know there were any lead figures in this box. Thank you, Becky M, for packing this for me. You're a very nice person. So we've got a trumpeter and a officer, which is quite nice. Let's pop these guys out. Let's have a look. We have, that is the officer, and he looks very splendid in his uniform, and he's got a nice sword, waving his sword in the air. And then we have the trumpeter here, a nice chap. When painting Napoleonics, as a rule of thumb, trumpeters wore reverse colours. So this trumpeter would be in, say, if your regiment was blue, it had blue cuffs, then the trumpeter would have blue cuffs. Although after 1812 that was going out, and they didn't tend to replace uniforms, they were expensive, and so by the later battles trumpeters would probably be wearing normal clothing just like a regular soldier, but on principle, theoretically, you should be in reverse colours. And that's the horse just there, very nice horse there. Right, so for the actual figures, let's have a check. I think all the sprues are the same. Are they? Yes. Right, so here's the sprue. They're the horses. That's the inside out of the horse, so that's the horse. So you've got some nice running action for the horse, for your cavalry to look like they're charging across the battlefield. That's the mounted guys themselves, and the heads and the lance. And that's it. There's actually no strings and whistles with this particular box. I know with the British you get the British Dragoons, you have the option to turn them into hussars, because you get two sets of bodies, one for hussars and one for not. You also get different types of equipment as to whether or not they're hussars or household dragoons. You also get a household dragoon helmet. You get the hussar hat, shako, and then you get the, off the top of my head, the dragoon shako, or there's another helmet in there as well, which I think is for the light dragoons, Chialaton, so a light horseman. The one with the sort of sausage down the back of the helmet, that's the British Chialaton. Yeah, so they're the guys. Dragoons were an interesting choice by Mr. Bonaparte. Dragoons were mainly used to move troops around the battlefield, believe it or not. Earlier dragoons were used as policemen. They were basically mounted police in times of peace, or if the army was occupying an area. But as time went on, when Napoleon took over, by the time of Napoleon, dragoons were sort of the standard cavalrymen for the French army, and they had a second set of stirrups on their horse, and they would use to move around voltigeurs and stuff like that. So if you wanted to deploy voltigeurs out in front of your army, the dragoons would ride them in. So they were like a ferry service. Now, obviously, the dragoons are great. They ride around on horseback with a sword and shout loudly, and can be used to ferry troops, but they're not that good up against enemy troops. Enemy infantry you're pretty much useless against, and against enemy cavalry you're outclassed. Enemy cavalry have got heavy cavalry and stuff like that, and given that most of your army is dragoons, Napoleon upgraded them with a lance. And he did plan on, as the Napoleonic Wars were coming to an end, about the time he was lost in Russia, he did want to replace all of the dragoon regiments with lancers. So theoretically, by the time of Waterloo, the entire French army would more or less be equipped with lancers. Didn't actually happen. Never got around to doing it. He was dethroned, and so the French army basically fell apart. So lancers were way more useful, because if your enemy get into a square, then you just ride up to the square and stab them with these. If your enemy are on horseback and they're better than you, you stab them with one of these because they're further away from you and they can't get to you. Also, they're scary because they have lancers and they scare people. So lancers are pretty cool. They're useful troops on the table. On the downside, the British never adopted the lance, and the reason we never adopted the lance is because that's not actually how we fought. The French were fighting Napoleonic Wars. We were fighting our own personal war, which had very little to do with the way that the French used their troops. So the French used columns, we used lines. Our troops didn't need column because we tended to be, we were a volunteer army, we were better trained, or generally better trained, and we had a large amount of ammunition to expend, and so the French didn't. The French army was way bigger than the British army, and so we could spend money on different things, and our horses were only used at the end of a battle. We didn't. The French would send horses in whenever there was an opening to send cavalry in, and your horses, like these guys, would find themselves stuck into the enemy when the enemy hadn't necessarily broken. Now, dragoons are great and hussars are great if your enemy are broken, because if your enemy are running away, then hussars and dragoons will just hunt them down there. It's absolutely brilliant. But against formed units, your dragoons aren't much use. Now, originally dragoons did dismount to fire, and in Russia a lot of the dragoon regiments were actually on foot. They didn't even have horses, probably because the French ate them, but generally the French dragoons did fight on foot. But by the later war years, this cavalry unit will cover from 1889 to 1815, which is the entirety of the Napoleonic War. By the end of the war, the idea of dragoons dismounting has pretty much gone. The French just didn't do that. Neither did most other countries. The British did. So, just like the French, the British would use people like dragoons and hussars to transport troops. So if you remember the Battle of Waterloo, when the British cavalry charged and the French lancers came in behind them and took them out, we actually lost a lot of infantry in that battle, because the Scots Greys and the Household Guard, they rode in with two Scotsmen on each side of their horse. So there was one cavalry rider and two infantry per horse. And that's great because we were attacking. Unfortunately, the poor infantry got left behind when the lancers came, and that's when the lance really comes into it, because one thing you don't want to do is deal with a really angry Scotsman. And if you've got a lance, that's where the lance really comes into its own, because you can just jab away at the enemy. There's nothing they can do about it. But you know what, I'm actually spending more time talking about dragoons than the actual unboxing, so I'll just leave the video there, shall I? And then we'll get into more detail on it when I've done the figures up. So these are the French dragoons. That's the figure on the box, and it's cool. And I must say, I did not know it had the lead figures in it, and I think that's really cool. I know I've just got another box of French infantry, and they have lead figures in too. So that's awesome. So thank you very much for Warlord Games. They're brilliant figures. So yes, thank you very much for watching. This has been Imperator Vespasian, talking far too much about horses. And leave a comment and like and subscribe if you feel like it, and I'll just leave now and go and lay down in a quiet room. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.